So, Nick, we're seeing quite a lot of movement, I think, out of Lansing with the realignment of the MDQ and water infrastructure being talked about a lot more regularly. What is your take on really some of this movement happening at the state level? Because we've seen movement before, and
Right.
unfortunately, it hasn't led anywhere.
I am cautiously optimistic with some of the changes that we're seeing out of Lansing and our state government regarding water quality and then also infrastructure and water affordability issues.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still a real challenge here, and that is that even though we have a governor that has made water affordability and environmental justice part of her major initiatives that she would like to see during her first term, including reorganizing our whole state environmental agency structure to really focus on water quality and environmental justice. The funding piece, I think, is going to be critical, though, because you still have Republican-controlled legislature, and so currently this debate over road funding is something that we're in, trying to raise more money to actually pay for fixing our roads. When you get to that discussion about water infrastructure for treatment, for delivery, all of that, it's big money, very, very expensive. And many of our systems in Michigan are past their expected life cycle, meaning that our drinking water treatment facilities, our wastewater plants, they need significant capital investment to be able to continue functioning at a moderate level. And if we wanted to look at removing emerging contaminants out of our water, like the discussion around PFAS or other chemical contaminants in our water, we're not able to do that right now in Detroit because our systems aren't designed for that. So, and that's big money. So where do you get that money? Are you going to turn around and go back to the same ratepayers that are struggling to pay their bills today by raising their water rates? Doesn't seem like a good solution. So, are you able to somehow have more revenue sharing or something coming in from Lansing into municipalities to do water infrastructure projects? I think that'll be really important. But, we're going to have to make a significant investment in our water infrastructure. I think the governor gets that, but I still think there's a disconnect between the governor and the legislature in understanding how much money we need for these infrastructure projects and then figuring out how to get it. Higher taxes, property tax assessments, these kinds of things are what you're looking at to try and get more money into the system, water system, outside of just raising rates. I mean, raising rates is not going to be the issue because we already have, again, people that are really struggling to pay for those rates to be able to have water supply to their home.
Are there reliable estimates on how much needs to be invested?
There are. I mean, there's been assessments done by, I can't remember the name. There's like these, civil engineering societies. Carol Miller could probably tell you. There's these studies that have been done in kind of, the needs assessment for what we need in our infrastructure. I mean, I'm sure just in Michigan it's in the billions with a B that we need for upgrades to our water and wastewater systems. And it's important to remember that our water, when we talk about water supply, I'm talking about turning on the tap, and this is all one big recycling system. So we're pulling water out of Lake Huron or the Detroit River, using it in Detroit, goes to our wastewater treatment plant, and then goes down to Lake Erie where Toledo's pulling it in for drinking water. They use it, put it in Lake Erie, it goes down to Cleveland. I mean, there's this big recycling network, and so it's not just on the drinking water side of things. We have to make sure that we're really investing money in our wastewater treatment plants so that we're discharging wastewater into the Detroit River, into surface waters as cleanly as possible, because otherwise it just makes everything else harder and more expensive when you're trying to pull that water out again and treat it for drinking water purposes. So anyway, it's just one big recycling system, the way that we use our water, and that's something that I think that story needs to be told too, because rubs some people the wrong way when they think like, oh, we're drinking, Port Huron's toilet water. Well, in a sense, yes, we are. I mean, we're part of this,
Recycling.
right? You're just recycling this resource, but it's not a resource that is completely renewable, right? We have to make sure that we take good care of it. So, I think you're getting there with some of this movement in Lansing, but I still think there's a disconnect between the need, which everyone agrees is there, and then the will to pay for it, and to actually look at tax increases and things to actually pay for that infrastructure improvement. That's the piece I don't think we're there yet. And then finally, I'll just say that there's been some work on our environmental rules around drinking water, specifically with lead. So we now have a lower threshold action level for lead than the 15 parts per billion, which is in the National Safe Drinking Water Act. Now in Michigan, it's 12 parts per billion, meaning that if you have lead levels detected at that level in a water supply, alarm bells go off, and there's all sorts of management steps that need to be taken to fix that problem. Michigan, now we have the most protective standard in the nation, but 12 parts per billion lead is that's not a health-based standard, right? If you talk to any doctors, they'll say, well, there's really no safe level of lead, right? This is just, so it's better. And even in that case, that rule change has been challenged, including by Great Lakes Water Authority. So they sued the state of Michigan, saying that law should be invalidated for a number of reasons. They're also upset with this provision saying that all lead service lines, drinking water lines, have to be replaced by, I think, 2040 or something like that. And municipalities are saying, we don't have the money to do that work. State of Michigan, this is an unfunded mandate. You're telling us to replace these lead lines without any money. So they're suing over these rule changes. So even after Flint, after all of that, just all the horrible outcomes, just the terrible stories and experiences that our citizens in Flint have gone through, even after all that, we're still not getting significant movement on just the lead issue in drinking water. So it just shows you like how hard it is to move the needle on some of this stuff when we're talking about investing public money and public resources. Right. That still seems to be a real challenge in Lansing, even with all of the focus on drinking water that we've had.
Why is that, do you think? Is that because of I'm speculating over here, but is it because of this misplaced belief that something that happened there could never happen to us, although the science and the history tells us that's patently untrue?
Right.
I mean, why do you think that there's this strong urge not to see that actually, that happen?
I think there's a real lack of understanding on how these infrastructure systems actually work and operate that deliver our drinking water. And you go back to the lead problem, and this is something that the history here is kind of fascinating. I mean, lead, the chemical symbol Pb, that's from the Latin word, which and then that's actually plumber. So like you like lead was used in plumbing, right? It was like a malleable, soft metal that was good to like make pipes to deliver water, like going back to whenever Roman times and stuff. They're actually doing this stuff, and so for a long time the thinking was, well, we use lead to move water through these systems. So in older cities like Detroit, we have who knows how many thousands of lead pipes that are connecting water mains to homes, and the cost of going through and replacing all those is pretty staggering. Now, if you're able to treat the water with this, it's a phosphate, it's called orthophosphate, that creates a coating on the pipes, which prevents lead from leaching into the water. That corrosion control was not added in Flint, which is what ultimately led to that water crisis. But I don't even think most of our legislators even understand those basics. You have lead pipes, you have a way to treat the water to try and coat them. I think there's just a real lack of understanding on how all this stuff works. So then when you flip around and start talking about billions of dollars to fix this stuff, their eyes just sort of glaze over. It's not an excuse. It's just, I think, a lack of education. And I know this isn't really the point of our discussion here today, but our system is broken in Michigan, where I think because of term limits largely, we have legislators in Lansing who don't understand anything about environmental policy or about delivery of services like water infrastructure, because they're in the House for a couple of years and then they're like chairing a committee after year 2 because they've got 2 more years and then they're going to be term limited out. I mean, they're like, it's like this revolving door of people in Lansing. They never get the chance to learn about these issues and to really become leaders within their individual parties or within their caucuses to kind of push for significant investment in these areas. The people that are informing our legislators, and this is a broad brush statement, but the people that are informing our legislators are lobbyists. These are paid lobbyists, and many of these paid lobbyists, sure, some of them work for water utility companies and stuff, but the vast majority of them are working for groups that are anti-tax, or that are telling our legislators constantly, like, we need to be, cutting spending on government infrastructure, starve the beast kind of stuff. And like, by and large, at least over the last decade or so, those types of influences, those types of voices have been given an outsized influence in Lansing, meaning lobbyists. They're the ones that have been setting the agenda. So I think that's a huge problem that we can't ignore, is that you've got a legislature that's been significantly influenced by special interest lobbyists, and they're not always thinking about what's in the public good. They're thinking about kind of protecting their own skin politically, and that's a huge problem. And I think not having that long institutional memory within a legislature is a real challenge. You have people that have been there for 20 years that are like, oh yeah, I remember 20 years ago when we learned about the wastewater treatment plant and the importance of spending. I mean, you need that, or you just kind of miss out on a lot of opportunities to be forward thinking and planning and all that.
So, the lack of federal funding is also, elephant in the room, right? In terms of one of the reasons for why the water infrastructure has been just allowed to degrade without significant investment over time. But there's also, especially with the recent news on lead contamination in Detroit public schools, there's also a lack of federal guidelines in terms of contamination in
Testing,
schools, for instance. Is there any movement or any sort of legislative or legal effort afoot to address any of these situations?
Well, there's a real lack of clear direction from our federal government on water quality testing within our schools and setting standards for requiring testing within schools. I mean, we just don't have that. I mean, with the Flint water crisis, it became apparent pretty quickly that we weren't testing any of our schools or public buildings for lead in our water, and so the city of Detroit ended up having to get grant money from a foundation, I think, to actually pay for that testing, and maybe the state of Michigan helped them out a little bit too. I don't remember, but really remarkable that here we have children going to these buildings every day and drinking this water, and we don't even know what the water quality is at these buildings. And it's not just the lead coming or water coming in from pipes that may be grabbing lead or lead leaching into that water. You also have the fixtures within these buildings. So a lot of our school buildings in Detroit are older buildings, and so the drinking fountains, the components in those drinking fountains might have been soldered together with lead, or you have other fixtures that are another way for a pathway for lead to get into the water. So all that hadn't been done. So at the federal level, there has not been a big push to change whether it's the Safe Drinking Water Act, which regulates contaminants in our drinking water, or any sort of testing through Department of Education or other federal agencies that could actually require that type of work to be done. We haven't seen it. There were a couple hearings after the Flint water crisis, but they were largely about information about the crisis in general, and not really drilling into how can we make sure that we're protecting people today. There just hasn't been that movement. Now there's a great degree of foot dragging on the part of EPA, the current EPA, at assessing whether we need to change our standards for things like PFAS and other emerging contaminants. We're just not getting answers from our federal government. So, Michigan's looking at stepping in and setting some of our own drinking water standards, but it takes time. It's a challenge, and really, we haven't had leadership at the federal level for a long time on promoting water quality from a drinking water perspective. We've been somewhat fortunate in the United States that we haven't had 10 Flints, or related crises dealing with water quality. I think we take for granted that here we are in the United States, wealthiest country in the world. We've got infrastructure that can, we turn on the tap, you don't have to worry about it. I think we've been very lucky that we haven't had more of these incidents. Of course, there's been a lead crisis in Washington, D.C., and there's been other cities that have had waterborne illness type of issues. But really, I think we've been lucky that we haven't had more of these problems, because we haven't been updating our legal requirements to ensure good water quality, and we haven't been investing in our infrastructure.
So amidst all of this uncertainty and ambiguity, is there anything that gives you hope in terms of this concerted effort involving people such as yourself, community organizers, healthcare practitioners, to address water security in just nationwide, I guess, but especially Detroit?
Yeah, I mean, there are some things that give me hope, and you're absolutely right that if you're working in environmental law, you're working trying to promote public health and environmental responsibility. There aren't a lot of popping the champagne type of moments like, hey, we got another big victory. We don't have a lot of those, right? It's incremental work. It's like trying to make incremental changes that over time provide a big benefit to public health in the environment. And so you have to realize when you're doing this type of public interest environmental work that it is an uphill battle in many cases, but you get to work with just incredibly amazing people that are so passionate. I mean, the organizers on the ground that are working on these water affordability issues, that are working on trying to right the wrongs and to seek justice for people, are really just some of the best people you'll ever meet anywhere. And so it really is invigorating to be able to work with people that are on the front lines of these issues. And that, if you think about it, I mean, of course, everybody says, well, okay, Flint water crisis was this horrible thing that really brought a lot of attention to the water crisis. Well, I mean, the only reason there's all that attention there is because people in Flint weren't just going to be sold this line from the state of Michigan that everything was fine. Mm-hmm. They stood up and said no, and they organized themselves. They started talking with advocates in Detroit and in other cities, and really made Flint an issue that could not be ignored. And so beyond that, then now you've got all of, I think, these social movements where water, we'll just look at our last election in Michigan, so the gubernatorial race. I mean, we had gubernatorial candidates, talking about water quality, talking about the Great Lakes, not as like, this thing that, well, we all care in our hearts about the Great Lakes, it's part of our culture as a region, that whole thing, but about like, we need this water. Water is necessary for life, and water. This questions about water being a human right being like part of that whole gubernatorial campaign. I mean, really like a big shift from where we've been previously. So I think what gives me hope is that there is a recognition that water is something that is so fundamental to us as humans. It's something that we need, and I think particularly younger people are really getting this as part of like maybe the climate change debate has sort of got in there about how like water access and fresh water availability is going to be the challenge of probably later this century and then certainly the next century. And so I think people get that, and so at the macro level there's this understanding that like, wow, water is like a big issue we really need to focus on. And then I get excited when you go from that to people on the ground saying like, okay, how do we make sure that my neighbor down the street gets her water turned back on, or how do we make sure that she's doing okay? And really like kind of people helping people, you realize that there's a really, really strong network that kind of binds people together, that are in the face of huge daunting challenges, they're able to figure out a way to get by. Now, I hope that through my work over the years, you help people not just get by, but also thrive and being able to live their lives to the fullest. I mean, that's really what we want. But there's these kind of little things that come along the way. And really, what inspires me is just getting to work with again some of these folks that are on the ground doing just incredible work, organizing and trying to provide direct services to people to help them. I mean, it's really powerful to be able to experience that.
To reflect on another big picture topic, I guess, environmental justice. What does environmental justice mean for you?
Environmental justice to me, it's actually many things. I mean, there's a definition that the Environmental Protection Agency puts out there. There's environmental justice principles that have been adopted by many different social justice types of organizations. But for me, I think about process. So this would be like procedural justice, and this is probably because I'm a lawyer and a law teacher, that I'm always thinking about how can we use our procedures to ensure that everybody gets a voice in the process, that people in the neighborhood that have been shut out of the environmental decision-making process forever, that they're involved and that their voice is heard and their voice is given equal weight to people with the money and the power and the influence. Okay, so making sure that there's processes in place to ensure that those people are involved in the decisions that affect them personally. The other piece that I always focus on, other than that sort of like involvement in making sure, things like translating permit notice documents that go out into the neighborhood. I mean, if the whole neighborhood's Bangladeshi and it's stuff's in English, I mean, like, how are they going to know that there's even a meeting scheduled to discuss this issue? So that's something that we see time and time again. South Dearborn, very high Yemeni population, and they're putting out notices about a public meeting in English. It's like, well, they're not going to read it, right? They're not going to show up if they can't read it. So, okay. So anyway, that sort of procedural stuff is important. But really, what I'm really focused on now with environmental justice is this question of benefits. Okay, people that are experiencing the pollution, the burden of the pollution, that have these industrial facilities sited in their neighborhoods, they deserve some of the benefits from that industrial activity, that pollution, and that's something that we just haven't figured out how to get there. And what I mean by that is, if I'll give a personal example for me. Okay, so I live in a suburb. When I turn on the light switch, I get the benefit of electricity coming into my home that I pay a rate for to have that electricity. I am not, where I live, directly influenced by particulate matter from the coal plant that's generating that electricity. But there's a kid that lives in River Rouge that lives next door to that coal plant. He's turning on the light switch, paying the same rate for that electricity as I am, but he's also dealing with all of the particulate matter and sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, et cetera, that's falling onto his home. And so how do we figure out a way to kind of fix that equation where the burdens and the benefits are not distributed equally from environmental pollution? And so I'm really interested in trying to get at that issue. I mean, how can we appropriately compensate people that are dealing with all of the burdens of this pollution, while the rest of society benefits? And I think, to me, like, we're not going to get to justice until we answer that question and figure that out. There's just some really interesting research done recently looking at race and how white people cause a heck of a lot more pollution, okay, yet they don't live next to facilities that are highly polluting, okay? So you've got, and you can cut these things different ways, class, et cetera, but race is actually the best way to look at this, because it's the best indicator of who is creating the most pollution based on their consumption and what they're buying and using, and flying on planes, going vacations and stuff, and then where all of those products and things are developed. The people that live next to those facilities are largely people of color. And so, again, you've got these complete inequalities. And so that's when I think about environmental justice, that's what lately I've really been focusing on, this question of benefits. Who gets the benefit? If you've got the refinery in your neighborhood and it's polluting your school where your kid goes to school, and it's polluting you when you walk to the park with your children, is that company at least contributing its fair share to your tax base in your community? Are they investing in educational programs? Are they investing in other types of infrastructure that can help your community? I mean, the answer has been no, and so I think we need to figure out a way to do that. Otherwise, they're just externalizing all of these harms onto people in their community, and then other folks benefit. So,
is there a way to translate that frame of that benefits frame when you're thinking about water affordability, for instance, and maybe a tiered rate system?
Right.
Because I've heard arguments from some community organizers, which I think highlight the reparations frame.
Right.
Our forefathers built this, so we shouldn't be paying as much.
Right.
And I wonder if that frame doesn't quite get as far, especially when you're thinking of preaching beyond the choir, right. I guess. So I'm wondering if you can think of different frames that would perhaps resonate with broader audiences, and
right.
would benefits maybe be one of them?
Right.
And highlighting justice. I
think benefits, when we talk about water security and water supply and all of that, I think we have to take a step back, and because when I talk about benefits from things like buying a new car, or using the oil that's refined at the oil refinery in my new car, like those benefits are something that I couldn't experience in my life, really without any sort of harm to me personally, right? Just on the basis of where I live and where I recreate, etc. What's interesting with water is that we all need water to live. Okay, this is a fact. And so when I think about like a tiered rate structure or some way, like from my perspective, we need to figure out a way for everybody to get water to live. Okay, so some communities have called this a lifeline rate, where like you figure out, okay, you know what, the first whatever it is, 5,000 gallons a month, and I'm just pulling this out of nowhere, but the first 5,000 gallons a month going into everybody's home free of charge. Okay. Beyond that, then the meter starts running, and you could figure out an amount that would be, for average family, average use, for domestic purposes. I don't want somebody, running a car wash off their lifeline rate, right? But like, what do people need for basic health and sanitation? We all just get that as free water, right? And then above that, that's when you start seeing the rate increase. I would also like to see the more water that is used, either by individuals or by businesses, et cetera, that then they actually would pay a higher rate. Conversely, what happens often is that large industrial users get a lower rate for their use. It's almost like the sort of reverse incentive where you use more water and you pay less for it. Okay, so I think looking at those types of things are a way to kind of restructure the framing. I like the idea of just everybody gets water. We set a level that like everybody gets, and then beyond that, that's when the meter starts running. I don't know if that would actually get anywhere, but if you think about it, it can make a lot of sense, because you're eliminating this whole dance of water shutoffs and turn the water back on. I'd love to see how much it costs to do all these water shutoffs. Like I like that's something that I would really love to see. Like what is to send the guys out with a little thing to to turn off the water and just all of that. I would love to know like what that actually costs versus the amount of money that they've been recovering from lost rates. And the final thing I'll say on this is that there is so much loss of water within our system because of holes in our infrastructure and leaky pipes that a few years ago I did sort of a back of the napkin calculation based on some numbers that I heard about the loss to the system. It's like there's actually we're losing enough water right now that if we were able to actually keep that within the system, we could just give water to all these people that are having their water shut off for free. Okay, so it's not a question of do we have the water, do we have the resources. It's just that we're completely misallocating these resources, and I think we're focusing on all the wrong things. It's easy to look down on people for not paying their water bill without thinking about all of the structural reasons as to why they're in that position to begin with. And I don't think we solved that overnight, but we need to get to a place where, people need water to live. We're going to figure out a way for everybody to get water to be able to live and for basic sanitation. Right. And then beyond that, we can figure out rates to be able to pay for the water to be cleaned and distributed around. And from my perspective, I think we've been giving water away much too cheaply to industrial users for manufacturing, et cetera, in this region. There's this idea, we have a lot of water relatively, right? We're in the middle of 20% of the world's fresh surface water right here in the Great Lakes. A lot of groundwater too, so there's always this attitude of we just have water, right? That's one of the reasons why we're here in Detroit, is because of our access to water and for manufacturing purposes and all that. But we need to really start rethinking that and treating this water as, yes, it's a resource, but it's something that we need to be much better stewards of. And oh, by the way, while we're sitting here in the midst of all this water, we have many of our fellow citizens that have their tap cut off, right? And so it just doesn't make sense. We have to figure out a better way to do it.
Can you recount a story of a person who inspired you, or a person whose own experiences perhaps moved you, or maybe an event that you were at, that you witnessed, that got you excited, or again negatively perhaps you felt despondent perhaps, but can you recount an incident or an event like that which touched you related to water?
Sure. So this is probably 4 or 5 years ago now. There was a meeting of some advocates and attorneys to try and talk about this water shutoff issue, and they were considering some litigation to try and this was back when the city was under emergency management, and there was an attempt to basically allow there was an attempt to stop the water shutoff process through suing the emergency manager, and so I was at this meeting, and it was up at the St. Regis Hotel up there at Grand Boulevard in Woodward, and we're in the ballroom, and person after person, they were going up and just kind of telling their stories about. I mean, there are people that had these like astronomical bills that like, I mean, you would have to be like having every single faucet in the house like running full blast 24/7 to be able to get to that amount of money, to that amount of water use to be able to have a bill like that. And they're sitting there like, you know, I take them at their word. Like, I'm not doing that, right? I'm not just running every single, you know, tap at full blast, just running around flushing toilets all day long. I mean, who does that, right? It doesn't make any sense. And you hear these stories of people that are like suffering under this crippling debt, and it just sounds like the whole thing is just wrong, right? The whole thing is a farce. And so you hear that, and it's like, okay. And these were people, the people that were there. I mean, these are, you know, fairly sophisticated folks, right? That understand what's going on, and so that to me, I was like, just like, wow, there are so many issues within this system, you know, not related to people not paying their water bills, but the way that we're metering water, the way that these collection systems are operating, and this weird incentive that we're, you know, the default is to just shut off people's water rather than trying to work with them. I mean, it's just so yeah. So like, I mean, sitting there and hearing all these stories, but I remember in particular there was one woman who was talking about this like astronomical bill, and you know, she had it, she's like waving it around, and I was just like,
that's crazy.
How do we get? Like, how is this even? And the fact that even like gets out of the water department without someone being like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, it would be like if you had like a fire hydrant just gushing, you know, 24 hours a day. And that's what. And there were a lot of people that had similar types of experiences.
We're
Were just
thousands of dollars.
completely outlandish amounts of money.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so hearing that story is like, wow, like that just made it real for me. You know, like I'm thinking to myself like, you open up the mail and you get this bill for, you know, $5,000 for a while. I mean, what do you do? Like, where do you turn? Where do you go? And again, you know, I'm an attorney. I should be able to figure this stuff out. But I had that response. And so, I mean, that's just one example. And then like just hearing like, okay, how you work through that and start to think like, okay, if this is happening to me, it's probably happening to other people, and we need to get out there and do something about it.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Is there something that we have not covered, or any last words or parting comments that you think we should?
I mean, I think we covered a lot of it. I mean, I guess my main takeaway with this question about water security is that, you know, I think it says something about us as a people and as a society that we're even having this discussion, right? Like the fact that we've got to this point where we're talking about like, how can we come up with a rate structure that like provides water for our most vulnerable citizens? I mean, it's insane. Like we have to like get outside of this sometimes and just be like, here we are in Detroit in 2019 and we're talking about like how we can figure out a way to get water into people's homes so they don't get sick and so that they're able to live. I mean, like we get so into the weeds on this stuff that I think sometimes we miss the whole point, which is like, this is nuts, right? This is completely nuts that we've allowed this to happen and to our people, and like how are we, how do we get to this point? And so, and like how are we not like, you know, pulling every single lever of government to fix it, right? Like that to me is just shocking, and I think a real indictment on us and I'm saying us, but you know, collectively that that our system has got to this point where it's failing so many people.